It was 1975, and Admiral Viktor Grishin, commander of the Soviet Pacific Fleet, stared at the plotting table in his underground command bunker in Vladivostok. His face, normally a mask of Bolshevik certainty, was pale. On the board, two groups of symbols were converging. The blue markers, representing his own Eastern Fleet, were moving in a complex, pre-planned ballet. This was Okhotsk 75, the largest global naval exercise in Soviet history. It was meant to be a staggering demonstration of Soviet naval power, a signal to Washington that the world's oceans no longer belonged to them. Grishin's force was the centerpiece, a massive pincer movement designed to simulate the interception of an American carrier strike group attempting to penetrate the bastion of the Sea of Okhotsk. The red markers, representing the Western or enemy fleet played by the American carrier strike group 7, centered on the USS Enterprise, were not cooperating. They were not sailing into his trap. Instead, they had sidestepped his northern pincer, ignored his submarine screens, and sliced directly toward a vulnerability in his southern flank he thought only his own admirals knew. They moved with an impossible, infuriating confidence. It was as if they had his operations plan open on their own flag bridge. "They know," a junior officer whispered, forgetting his protocol. Grishin's head snapped around. "Know what, Lieutenant? That we are at sea? This is an exercise." But the lieutenant was right. This wasn't clever sailing. This wasn't a lucky guess. The Americans had anticipated his every feint, his every maneuver, his every fallback position for 3 days straight. They reacted not after his ships moved, but as they moved. Sometimes it felt before they moved. His signals were sent by high-frequency radio, encrypted with the unbreakable Topaz cipher. His most critical orders, the ones coordinating the entire fleet, traveled on a different path. They went by secure landline, a coaxial cable buried deep in the earth, running from his bunker north along the coast, before diving into the frigid, dark waters of the Sea of Okhotsk. This cable was the artery of his command. It was, he had been assured, the most secure communications link in the entire Soviet Union. It connected Vladivostok, the home of the Pacific Fleet, with Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, the fortress peninsula that guarded the fleet's nuclear-armed Delta-class submarines. The cable lay on the seabed of a body of water that was, for all practical purposes, a Soviet lake. The Sea of Okhotsk, a fortress of nature, bordered by the Siberian mainland to the west, the Kamchatka Peninsula to the east, and the Kuril Islands to the south. The entrances were narrow, shallow, and choked with Soviet listening posts, minefields, and patrol routes. In winter, the sea was an impenetrable shield of pack ice. No enemy surface ship could enter it undetected. No enemy submarine could navigate its treacherous, poorly charted shallows. And the cable itself? It was just a wire on the muddy bottom, emitting no signal, invisible to sonar, shielded by hundreds of feet of crushing black water. It was as safe as a message locked in a vault inside the Kremlin. And yet, the Enterprise sailed as if it was reading his mind. Admiral Grishin slammed his fist on the table. The markers jumped. "Get me the 3rd Directorate," he snarled. "Now!" He didn't mean the local KGB office. He meant the 3rd Chief Directorate, the High Command of Military Counterintelligence, the organization whose sole purpose was to hunt traitors within the ranks. Because to Admiral Grishin, the conclusion was inescapable. The Americans weren't lucky. They weren't brilliant. They had a source. The exercise was a disaster, a public humiliation. But the reality was far worse. If the Americans had a mole who could feed them the operational plans for Okhotsk 75, they had a mole who could feed them the launch codes, the war plans, the patrol routes of his nuclear ballistic missile submarines. This wasn't a leak, it was a hemorrhage, and it threatened the entire nuclear deterrent of the Soviet Union. This is Cold War impact. The story of the Cold War is a story of secrets, and the most powerful secrets are the ones the other side doesn't even know are being kept. If you enjoy digging into these hidden conflicts, please consider subscribing. We have many more files to declassify. Within hours, the men from the 3rd Directorate arrived. They were not like the fleet officers. They wore ill-fitting suits, not uniforms. They moved quietly, their eyes cold and assessing. They were led by a colonel from Moscow, a man who saw ghosts in every shadow and traitors in every uniform. They sealed the command bunker. They confiscated logs, charts, and signal transcripts. They began interrogations, starting with the communications staff. The question was simple: Who had access to the full operations plan? The answer was terrifying. The Admiral, his chief of staff, the senior communications officer, a handful of aides. All were men with decades of loyal service, heroes of the Great Patriotic War or the sons of heroes. The idea of a traitor among them was poisonous. It was unthinkable. The investigators tore the bunker apart. They swept for listening devices, for bugs. They X-rayed the walls. They dismantled the cipher machines, checking for modifications. They analyzed the encrypted radio traffic, wondering if the Topaz code had finally been broken. They found nothing. No hidden microphones. No compromised machines. The cipher was, according to the cryptographers, mathematically perfect. The investigation widened, growing cancerous. Paranoia flooded the Pacific Fleet. Officers who had served together for 20 years suddenly stopped making eye contact. Promotions were frozen. Careers were silently ended. The KGB team descended on the communications hub in Vladivostok, the building where the landline physically connected to the undersea cable. They placed seals on the junction boxes. They put armed guards in the room 24 hours a day. And the leaks continued. It wasn't just major exercises, it was smaller things, moments of impossible coincidence. A Soviet Victor-class submarine would leave port on a silent patrol, only to find an American Los Angeles-class hunter-killer sub waiting for it in the deep channel, shadowing it from the moment it left the pier. A new, quiet propeller design was being tested, and the first time it entered the water, an American P-3 Orion patrol plane just happened to be flying overhead, dropping sonobuoys in a perfect bracket around it. The admirals in Moscow and the investigators from the KGB were baffled. They were focusing on human intelligence, humant, a mole, a spy. It was the only explanation that fit their worldview. The Americans had recruited a high-level source, a super-mole with godlike access to the Pacific Fleet's most sensitive plans. The hunt for this phantom traitor became the single highest priority for the KGB's Far East Directorate. They were hunting a ghost. They never once looked at the cable. Why would they? The concept was absurd. The cable was inert. It was just a wire. To tap, it would require finding it a 5-inch thick strand of metal and rubber buried in silt, in the middle of a vast, dark, sub-zero sea, thousands of square miles in size. It would mean doing so in the most heavily patrolled, aggressively defended waters on the planet, surrounded by Soviet sonar nets and surface patrols. And even if, by some miracle, an enemy found it, what then? Cut it? That would be detected instantly. Physically tap into it like a telephone lineman? That would mean sending divers down hundreds of feet into crushing pressure and total darkness to perform a complex electronics operation, all while a Soviet destroyer might be passing overhead. It was impossible. It was science fiction. The Soviets focused their search on men, on traitors, on compromised cipher keys, on radio frequency leaks. They tore their own fleet apart, searching for a betrayal that came from within. They were looking in the wrong place. They were looking at each other. They should have been looking down into the silent, crushing blackness of the seabed. The impossible was already happening. The ghost was real, and it was listening. The investigation began not with a scalpel, but with a hammer. The Third Directorate, led by the stone-faced colonel from Moscow, treated the Pacific Fleet as a compromised organ. His mandate was simple: find the leak, cut it out, and cauterize the wound. The cost to morale, to operational readiness, was irrelevant. The Rodina was bleeding secrets. This was the Great Purge of 1976. It was silent, invisible to the West, but devastating within the Soviet Navy. It started with the communications technicians, the men who physically handled the message pads and managed the encryption keys. They were subjected to days of relentless interrogation. They were isolated, sleep-deprived, and questioned about every detail of their lives. Did they have relatives abroad? Did they drink? Did they associate with foreigners? Did they have unexplained money? The polygraph machine, a recent and crude acquisition from the West, was used mercilessly, its needles scratching out a cartography of fear. Men who had served honorably for decades were suddenly reassigned to frigid radar outposts in Siberia. One senior communications officer, a veteran of the Battle of Stalingrad, was found dead in his small apartment from a self-inflicted gunshot wound after his third interrogation. The official report cited personal despair. The fleet knew better. When the lower ranks yielded nothing, the The investigators turned their cold gaze upward, toward the officer corps. This was a delicate, dangerous escalation. These were not simple technicians. These were members of the nomenklatura, the party elite. To accuse one of them was to accuse the party itself. The investigation became a shadow play. Instead of direct accusations, there were reviews. Committees were formed. A special commission flew in from Moscow, ostensibly to analyze the operational failures of Okean 7-5. Their real mission was to profile every senior officer in the Pacific Fleet's command structure. They read their fitness reports, their private correspondence. They interviewed their wives, their drivers, their aides. They looked for the slightest crack in the facade, a fondness for Western music, a complaint about slow promotions, a hint of intellectual doubt. Admiral Grishin, the man who had first reported the anomaly, found himself a prisoner in his own command. He was followed. His personal phone was monitored. He knew that if he failed to find the mole his investigators were hunting, the suspicion would inevitably settle on him. The hunter would become the prey. The paranoia was systemic. The Soviet system was built on a foundation of mistrust. The leak was simply the fertilizer that made it bloom. The technical investigation ran in parallel, a frantic effort to find a technological culprit. Naval engineers and signals specialists swarmed the command bunkers. They theorized that the Americans had deployed a new form of signals intelligence, or SIGINT. Their first theory was Tempest, the code name for the study of compromising electromagnetic emanations. Was the bunker itself leaking? Were the electronic pulses from the cipher machines, the teleprinters, the video displays, somehow radiating into the air, where a high-flying American spy plane or a ferret satellite in low Earth orbit could catch them and reconstruct the data? They lined the walls with lead and copper shielding. They installed new filters on the power lines. They grounded every piece of equipment. After months of work and millions of rubles, the command bunker in Vladivostok was one of the most electromagnetically silent places on Earth. And the leaks continued. They turned to the cable itself. Not the deep-sea portion that was still considered impossible, but the land-based trunk lines. KGB technicians walked the entire length of the cable from the bunker to the coast, scanning for induction taps, for any sign of disturbance. They found nothing but frozen mud and rocks. They theorized that perhaps the signals were leaking into the ground, measurable by hypersensitive magnetometers. This too proved a dead end. Every logical avenue, every technological possibility as they understood it, was a blank wall. This failure to find a thing, a bug, a tap, a leaky transmitter drove them back to the most terrifying conclusion of all. It had to be a man. This cognitive dissonance created the legend. The mole was no ordinary spy. He was a phantom, a barabashka, a poltergeist in the machine. He was dubbed Admiral's Ghost by the increasingly cynical officers. The ghost knew things he shouldn't. He knew things in real time. In one notorious incident, a brand new Victor II-class attack submarine was dispatched on a top-secret mission to test its new, ultra-quiet, 7-bladed propeller. The crew was hand-picked by the 3rd Directorate. The captain was given his orders by hand, after he was already at sea, via a coded acoustic message from a patrol boat. No radio was used, no landline was involved. His mission was to proceed to a specific, deep-water trench and run at different speeds. As he arrived at the coordinates, his sonar operator, a young man with the best golden ears in the fleet, frowned. He tilted his head, listening, and then he paled. "Contact, Comrade Captain. Bearing 090, classification, American, Los Angeles class." The American sub was already there, waiting for him. The news of this incident, which was classified at the highest possible level, spread through the fleet command like poison. It shattered their last remaining theories. This was not a pre-stolen operations plan. This was not a Tempest leak from a bunker hundreds of miles away. This was real-time, operational-level precognition. The Americans knew. The Soviet Admiralty began to feel like gods in a Greek tragedy, cursed to have their every move anticipated by an unseen omniscient oracle. How? The theories became wild, desperate. The KGB's wrong conclusion file grew thick. Theory 1. The super mole. The traitor was not in the fleet, he was in Moscow. He was a marshal, a member of the general staff, perhaps even someone inside the GRU or the KGB itself, with access to all signals, all plans. This theory was politically explosive. It set ministries against each other. The Navy distrusted the GRU. The GRU distrusted the KGB. The entire Soviet military apparatus began to consume itself in a quiet, bureaucratic civil war of suspicion. Theory 2. The psychic weapon. This was the dark whisper, the late-night, vodka-fueled speculation. The Americans, obsessed with the occult and parapsychology, had achieved a breakthrough. They were using psychic spies, remote viewers, who could see their maps, read their orders, and track their submarines from a building in Maryland. This theory, while sounding insane, was actually given serious consideration by certain fringe departments of the KGB who had their own parapsychology programs. It was, in a way, more comforting than the truth. A psychic spy was an act of God. A technological gap was a failure of the state. Theory 3. The subaquatic drone. A new radical idea. The Americans had deployed a fleet of small autonomous, nuclear-powered listening devices. Robots that could lie dormant on the seabed for months, listening to the acoustic signatures of their submarines. But this didn't explain how they read the encrypted cable traffic. It didn't explain the Enterprise incident. For years, the Soviet High Command stumbled in the dark. They were trapped in their own fortress, haunted by an enemy who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. They could not trust their men. They could not trust their machines. And they could not trust the very water that was supposed to be their shield. The bogeyman was real, and he was winning the war. While the Soviets tore their own navy apart, hunting for phantoms and traitors, the answer was already being retrieved. It wasn't in Moscow. It wasn't in the airwaves. It was being rewound, spool by spool, in a windowless, soundproofed clean room in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. The ghost was American, and it was a machine. The story of this machine begins not with an admiral, but with a problem. In the late 1960s, US naval intelligence knew the Okhotsk cable existed. They had its general location pinpointed on their maps. It was the central nervous system of the Soviet Pacific Fleet, connecting the brain in Vladivostok to the nuclear dagger in Petropavlovsk. The desire to read that traffic was overwhelming. But the problem, as the Soviets had correctly concluded, was that it was impossible. Tapping. A cable was something done by linemen on telephone poles, not by submarines in a hostile, ice-choked sea. Any attempt to cut the cable, splice into it, or even significantly disturb it would instantly change its electrical resistance, triggering alarms in Vladivostok. The act of listening would be as loud as a gunshot. Furthermore, the cable was in 400 feet of water, a crushing depth where human divers could only work for a few agonizing, inefficient minutes before needing to resurface a process that itself took hours. You could not run a covert, clandestine operation this way. It was a fantasy. But in the shadowed corridors of naval technology, one group's fantasy is another's engineering challenge. The solution came from a vessel that was itself a ghost of the Cold War's past, the USS Halibut. The Halibut was not a sleek, modern attack sub. It was a relic, one of America's first-generation nuclear-powered submarines, originally designed in the 1950s to carry the Regulus cruise missile. By the late 1960s, the Regulus was obsolete, a clumsy, surface-launched weapon in a world of sleek, underwater-launched Polaris missiles. The Halibut was a ship without a mission, a $60 million piece of floating scrap. Or rather, it was the perfect disguise. In 1968, the Halibut was given a deep ocean survey modification. This was its cover story. But the modifications were bizarre. A massive 28-foot-long, 10-foot-high hangar was welded into its hull, a space once meant for missiles. This was now a deep submergence research center. The submarine was outfitted with an array of strange, non-military equipment, powerful bow and stern thrusters, allowing it to hover and move sideways like a helicopter. Two massive steel skids, like skis, that allowed it to settle gently and silently onto the ocean floor, and a bat cave full of the most advanced deep-sea video cameras, side-scan sonars, and magnetometers in the world. Most critically, it was fitted with a complex saturation diving system. This was the key. In a saturation system, divers live in a pressurized chamber inside the submarine, their bodies saturated with a helium-oxygen mix that matches the pressure of the deep water outside. They no longer needed to decompress after every dive. They could live for weeks at a time at depth, exiting and re-entering the submarine through an airlock as if it were their underwater home. The Halibut's new official mission was to find lost Soviet hardware, like missile fragments from test launches. Its real mission, designated Ivy Bells, was something no one had ever attempted. It was to sail into the Sea of Okhotsk, find the 5-inch thick cable, and tap it without the Soviets ever knowing. In October 1971, the halibut slipped out of Pearl Harbor and vanished. It ran north, silent, deep. It threaded the needle of the Kuril Islands, diving below the Soviet sonar layers, navigating by maps that were often blank, relying on its new sonar to feel its way in the dark. The tension inside the black-hulled sub was agonizing. This was not a combat mission. There was no plan to fight. If they were detected by a Soviet destroyer or hunter-killer sub, their mission was not to engage. It was to abort. There was no survey cover story that would hold up for a nuclear-armed submarine found sitting on the seabed inside the most sensitive naval fortress in the world. They were, in every legal and military sense, spies. For days, the halibut crept along the bottom, its sonars pinging softly, mapping the mud. The crew called it mowing the lawn. Then, a faint line appeared on the sonar screen. The halibut settled onto the ocean floor on its giant skids. The thrusters kicked up a cloud of silt, which then settled. The only sound was the hum of the reactor and the scrubbers. The order was given. 2 divers, their bodies already acclimated to the 400-foot pressure, moved from the living chamber into the airlock. The outer hatch opened, a square of dim light in the absolute blackness. They stepped out onto the seabed. This was the moment of American ingenuity. The divers were not carrying wire cutters. They were carrying a device that looked like a futuristic clamshell, an induction tap. This was the impossible solution. The Soviets were worried about someone breaking the wire. The Americans had realized they didn't need to. Any electrical current, even one inside an armored cable, generates a faint, microscopic magnetic field outside the cable. This leakage is infinitesimal, but it is there. The US Navy had built a listener sensitive enough to hear that whisper. The divers, moving with dream-like slowness in the crushing cold, cleared the silt from the cable. They attached the first half of the massive tap pod, then the second, clamping it around the cable like a bracelet. They didn't cut. They didn't splice. They simply listened from the outside. The tap was connected to a massive electronics pod, the size of a small car, which the halibut had carefully lowered from its hangar. This pod contained a massive magnetic tape recording system, and to power it for an entire year, it had its own small nuclear battery, a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, or RTG. The divers worked for hours. They finished the connections, checked the seals. They re-entered the sub. The halibut lifted silently off the bottom, retrieved its anchoring equipment, and crept back out of the Sea of Okhotsk, leaving a silent, nuclear-powered, multi-ton listening device clamped to the Soviet Union's most secure line. A year later, the halibut returned. The divers went back down, retrieved the tapes, and installed a fresh reel. When the first tapes arrived at the National Security Agency, analysts were stunned. They were not prepared for what they heard. The Soviets, so confident in the security of their cable, were not encrypting all their traffic. Much of it was sent in the clear. It was raw, unfiltered, voice and teletype communication. The admirals, the political officers, the submarine captains, they were all talking openly. The Americans were not just intercepting signals, they were sitting in on the conference calls. They were reading the nightly status reports. They were listening to ship captains complain about their orders. This was the Admiral's ghost. This was the source of the impossible intelligence. When the planners for Okean 7-5 began their work, the US Navy already possessed a library of their entire naval doctrine. They had the call signs, the command hierarchy, the fallback plans, the patrol routes, the refueling procedures. They knew the quiet propeller tests were scheduled for the 3rd week of the month. They knew which submarine, the Victor II, was assigned to the test. They knew the coordinates of the deep-water trench it was assigned to use. The Americans at Okean 7-5 didn't need to read the live traffic. They didn't need a mole. They had the playbook. They had spent years studying the Soviet team's every practice, listening to their every locker room conversation. When the game began, the USS Enterprise Strike Group knew every play the Soviets were going to run before the Soviet admirals even called them. The Ghost was a tape recorder placed on the ocean floor by men who had sailed into the enemy's fortress, parked their submarine, and walked in the deep, all without making a sound. The Soviets were hunting for a man. They should have been hunting for a monster from the abyss. For nearly a decade, the Admiral's ghost haunted the Soviet Pacific Fleet, The paranoia it bred crippled careers, sowed deep institutional mistrust, and left the Soviet high command feeling naked and exposed. They had hunted for a mole, a traitor in their highest ranks, and found nothing. They had investigated impossible technologies and concluded they were in fact impossible. The mystery was total. The answer did not come from a brilliant KGB investigator or a lucky sonar operator. It came, as it so often did in the Cold War, from a place of simple human weakness. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was not in a smoke-filled room in Vladivostok. It was in a beige, bureaucratic office at the Soviet Embassy in Washington, D.C. on January 15, 1980. A nervous, disgruntled American man named Ronald Pelton walked in off the street and asked to speak to the KGB. Pelton was not an admiral. He was not a general. He was a low-level communications analyst for the National Security Agency, the NSA. He was a man with a $65,000 debt, over $240,000 today, and a detailed, photographic memory. For 14 years, he had worked in the heart of America's signals intelligence apparatus. He had read the reports. He had seen the transcripts. He knew exactly what the ghost was. And for the price of his debt, he was willing to sell it. The initial KGB reports from the embassy were met with disbelief in Moscow. The debriefing sessions were tense. Pelton, a man who had never even been on a submarine, began to describe with perfect technical accuracy a program so secret, so audacious, that the Soviet generals listening to the translation thought it was a trick. He called it Ivy Bells. He described the USS Halibut. He described its modification into a deep-sea special projects submarine. He described the saturation diving system, the bat cave, the ability to sit silently on the ocean floor. And then he dropped the bomb. He told them the Americans had not just sailed into the Sea of Okhotsk once. They had been doing it routinely for almost 9 years. He told them the target was the cable. He told them the method was an induction tap, a clamshell device that did not cut the wire but simply listened to its magnetic field. He told them it was powered by a nuclear battery. He even gave them the general coordinates. This was the shock moment. It was a revelation of such staggering scope that it recontextualized the entire previous decade. The admirals in Moscow, the KGB investigators who had ruined careers hunting for a non-existent supermole, were suddenly confronted with a truth that was far worse. It was not a mole, it was an occupation. The Americans had been living in their most secure bastion. They had placed a listening post on the floor of their private lake, attached to their private telephone line, and had been listening to their most intimate military secrets as if they were party chatter. The humiliation of Okean 7-5 was not a brilliant guess. It was the Americans toying with them. The Victor II submarine that was met by a Los Angeles-class hunter? The Americans had simply read the teletype assigning the mission and decided to show up. The paranoia was justified, but its target was wrong. They had been looking for a crack in their people. The crack was in their world. The technological gap was not a gap. It was a chasm. The Americans had done something the Soviets had calculated, with mathematical certainty, to be a physical impossibility. The futile response began immediately. It was an operation of pure, blind panic. The primary, immediate order was simple. Stop using the cable. But how? It was the only secure, high-bandwidth line connecting the two most important naval bases in the Far East. To stop using it was to blind the Pacific Fleet. They reverted to high-frequency radio transmissions, but this was a clumsy, slow, and obvious downgrade. Every message now had to be painstakingly encrypted using one-time pads, a slow manual process. Worse, those radio signals could be heard by every American listening post, spy plane, and satellite in the Pacific. The Americans might not be able to read the encrypted messages instantly, but they could see the volume of traffic. They knew by the sudden radio silence on the cable and the explosion of activity in the airwaves that their secret was out. The second, more desperate response was to find the tap. Admiral Grishin, his name now grimly cleared of suspicion, was ordered to dispatch a flotilla, but it was not a war fleet. It was a fleet of survey ships, deep-sea salvage vessels, and minesweepers. This was not a hunt, it was a garbage collection. Pelton's coordinates were good, but the area was still vast. For months, in 1980 and 81, Soviet ships mowed the lawn in their own sea, dragging chains, grapnels and magnetometers across the seabed. It was a slow, humiliating, and staggeringly expensive failure. They were looking for a device the size of a minivan in a lightless, muddy expanse larger than the state of Maryland. Finally, in late 1981, a salvage vessel's sensors snagged something. Divers were sent down. And there it was, barnacled, covered in silt, but unmistakably artificial. It was the tap. They hauled it to the surface. It was a moment of profound, sickening validation. The massive, complex piece of machinery, dripping with black water on the deck of a Soviet ship, was a monument to their failure. It was stamped with the insignia of the US Navy. Inside its hardened casing, they found the advanced electronics. They found the tape recording system. And they found the RTG, the small nuclear heart that had kept it alive and listening for years. They had captured the ghost. But it was far, far too late. The Americans had already upgraded. By the time the Soviets found the Halibut's tap, a new, more advanced submarine, the USS Parch, had already installed a new tap, a more sophisticated model that recorded more data and was even harder to find. When the Soviets finally recovered that one, the Americans simply installed another. The Soviet countermeasure was to build a new cable, and then another, this time with fiber optics. But the damage was done. The Americans had proven that no sanctuary was safe. No communication was secure. The Soviet Union's greatest fortress was a goldfish bowl, and the Americans had been staring into it for a decade. The final verdict on the Ivy Bells operation is not found in a single, explosive statistic, like a missile's kill ratio. Its power is in its duration. For nearly 10 consecutive years, the United States Navy and the National Security Agency possessed a direct, unencrypted, real-time feed into the central nervous system of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. This was not signals intelligence as the world knew it. It was not a game of cat and mouse, of intercepting faint radio waves and spending months in a sterile room trying to crack a cipher. It was a godlike omniscience. The Americans had a standing invitation to the enemy's war councils. They read the daily operational summaries. They listened to admirals complain about fuel shortages. They heard submarine captains confirm their patrol routes. They knew the technical specifications and test result failures of new torpedoes and sonar systems before the ink was dry on the reports. The killer statistic is the decade itself. 10 years of total information supremacy. When American admirals planned their moves in the Pacific, they were not wargaming against a hypothetical opponent. They were playing chess against an opponent whose every thought was audible. This advantage is incalculable. It rendered the entire Soviet Pacific Fleet a multi-billion ruble investment in thousands of ships, submarines, and aircraft, a hollow force. It was a giant with no secrets. This catastrophic failure was not the fault of a single bumbling admiral or a sleepy guard. It was a systemic failure, a terminal illness in the Soviet state itself. The tap in the Sea of Okhotsk was a perfect microcosm of why the Soviet Union would ultimately lose the Cold War. First, it was a failure of imagination. The Soviet system, rigid, hierarchical, and deeply conservative, was simply incapable of conceiving that such an operation was possible. Their own engineers, when tasked with the same problem, had declared it a fantasy. The mission required a culture that not only tolerated, but actively encouraged insane, high-risk, skunk-works innovation. It required throwing millions of dollars at a repurposed, obsolete submarine and trusting a small clandestine team to sail into the enemy's backyard and perform a surgical operation from science fiction. The American system, for all its flaws, fostered this precise brand of technological audacity. The Soviet system, which punished failure with a trip to the Gulag or a bullet, crushed it. Second, the Soviet response demonstrated the crippling cancer of their internal paranoia. When faced with an impossible ghost, their first, last, and only conclusion was internal betrayal. The Third Directorate and the KGB did exactly what they were designed to do. They hunted their own. They spent a decade and vast resources tearing their own navy apart. They destroyed careers, sowed dissent, and paralyzed their own command structure in the hunt for a non-existent supermole. The Americans didn't just tap a cable. They turned the Soviet Union's own immune system against itself, triggering an autoimmune disease of suspicion that inflicted far more damage than a torpedo ever could. This was the great divide of the Cold War. Imitation versus innovation. The Soviet economy was a marvel of imitation. It could steal the plans for an atomic bomb and build one. It could see a B-29 bomber and reverse engineer it. It could see a space shuttle and build a copy. But it could not invent the halibut's mission. It could not innovate the induction tap. It was a system perpetually one step behind, reacting to the last war's technology. Ivy Bells was a technology from the next war, a war of information, and it had been deployed against them before they even knew the war had begun. The impact was devastating. It forced the Soviets to pour billions of rubles they did not have into countermeasures. They laid new cables. They encrypted all traffic, a costly and inefficient bottleneck. They launched new, expensive Hunter satellites to try and spot the American submarines. But it was too late. The USS Parch, the USS Seawolf, and other newer ghosts simply found the new cables and tapped them too, using even more advanced, harder-to-find pods. This technological bleeding, repeated across every domain from aerospace to computing, was a quiet, constant drain on the weak Soviet economy. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, 1,000 secret projects. The Sea of Okhotsk was meant to be the bastion, the ultimate Soviet fortress, the deep, dark, icy vault where their nuclear deterrent was untouchable. The Ivy Bells operation was more than an intelligence coup. It was a profound philosophical statement. It was the Americans walking into that vault, spray painting "We were here" on the wall, and walking out, not just once, but every year, for a decade. It proved that in the new war there was no fortress, there was no front line, there was no sanctuary. The only defense was technology, and the only technology that mattered was the one the other side could not even imagine. The Cold War was a war of ghosts, and in the silent, crushing dark at the bottom of the world, the Soviet Union discovered, far too late, that it was the one being haunted.